The veil was still pinned to the pew when the rancher realized his bride was not coming back. Silas Farron stood at the front of the small, clapboard church in Redding Creek, Montana Territory in the summer of 1878 and counted the seconds by the creak of the ceiling fan someone had rigged from a barn pulley. 40 guests sat behind him in the heat, fanning themselves with hymnals, and the woman he had paid passage for all the way from San Francisco had walked halfway up the aisle, gone pale as bleached cotton, and bolted through the side door into the alley behind the mercantile. She had not looked back once. The preacher cleared his throat. Somewhere behind Silas, a child's toy horse clattered to the floor, and nobody moved to pick it up. Silas kept his eyes on the open door where the light poured in white and merciless, half expecting her shadow to reappear against it. It did not. "Well," said Sheriff Otis Dunbar, rising from the front pew with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never once been embarrassed in his life, "that's one way to end a Tuesday." A ripple of laughter went through the church, ugly and quick, the kind that told Silas exactly how this story would be told at the saloon by nightfall. He did not laugh. He turned instead and looked at the empty aisle, the dropped bouquet of black-eyed Susans wilting on the floorboards, and felt something in his chest go as flat and hard as the plains outside. He had built the Farron Ranch out of nothing but stubbornness and 200 head of cattle over 11 years, had buried a father and a brother in the same rocky plot behind the house, and had finally decided, at 34, that a man alone in that much silence was a man slowly going to seed. He had written to a marriage broker in San Francisco. He had paid for passage, for a proper dress, for a wedding announcement in the territorial paper. And the woman who had stepped off the stagecoach 3 days ago, cool and composed and clearly terrified beneath the composure, had just proven that none of it had been enough to make her stay. Sheriff Dunbar ambled up the aisle, thumbs hooked into his belt, grinning like a man who had just won a hand of cards he had not even meant to play. "Now don't you fret, Farron," he said, loud enough for the whole church to hear, because Otis Dunbar never said anything quietly if he could help it. "I happen to know there's another Zow girl sitting right there in the second pew who came along as chaperone. Younger one, quiet as a church mouse, which might suit you better anyway, given how the first one carried on." Every head in the building turned. Silas followed the sheriff's gaze to the second pew, where a young woman sat with her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone pale, her spine straight, her dark eyes fixed somewhere past the altar, as though she had already decided not to see any of this happen to her. Her name was Leanne Zow. She was 21 years old, and she had crossed an ocean and half a continent as a companion to her older sister, never once expecting that the wedding she was meant to witness would end with the sheriff of Redding Creek offering her up like a spare horse at a swap meet. "I don't need charity, Otis," Silas said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. "Ain't charity?" Dunbar's grin widened, showing a gold tooth that caught the light. "It's practical. You got a wedding paid for, a preacher already standing here sweating through his collar, and a church full of witnesses who came to see a marriage happen. Seems a shame to waste all that on account of one skittish girl losing her nerve." Silas looked at Leanne again. She had not moved, had not so much as blinked, but he saw the tension running through her shoulders like a wire pulled taut, and something in him, some old stubborn decency his mother had beaten into him before she died, refused to let this happen to her the way the sheriff intended it. "That's her choice to make," Silas said. "Not yours, not mine." The church went quiet enough that Silas could hear the wind working at the loose shingle on the roof, a sound that had annoyed him for 2 years and had never once seemed important until this exact moment. Leanne Zhao rose from the pew, smoothed her skirt with hands that were not quite steady, and walked to the front of the church with her chin level and her eyes fixed on nothing in particular. "I will speak for myself," she said, and her voice, when it came, was low and clear and carried none of the tremor her hands had shown a moment before. "Mr. Farron, a word, if you would permit it, outside." That was the moment the whole church understood this was not going to end the way the sheriff had staged it. They stood in the shade behind the church, away from the windows, the summer heat pressing down thick and dry, and Leanne did not waste time on pleasantries. "My sister has been afraid of marrying a stranger since the broker's letter first arrived," she said. "She agreed to come because our mother is ill in San Francisco, and the money you sent covered more than passage. It covered her medicine for a year. My sister ran because she is a coward about many things, but she is not a coward about that debt, and neither am I." Silas studied her, this woman who had just spoken more plainly to him in 30 seconds than his bride had managed across 3 days of careful, guarded silence. "You're saying you'd marry me to settle her debt?" "I am saying I will not stand in this town and be laughed at as a consolation prize by a sheriff who has clearly decided this is entertainment," Leanne said, and something sharp moved behind her composed expression. "If we are to discuss marriage, Mr. Farron, we will discuss it as two people making a bargain, not as a joke told at my expense in front of 40 strangers." It was the plainest thing anyone had said to him in 11 years, and Silas felt the corner of his mouth move, despite the wreckage of the morning behind him. "All right," he said, "then let's talk plainly. I've got 600 acres, 200 head of cattle, and more silence in that house than any one man ought to live inside of. I'm not asking you to love me. I'm asking if you'd rather build something real than go back to San Francisco with nothing to show for the ocean you crossed." Leanne was quiet for a long moment, longer than the sheriff would have liked, long enough that he stuck his head around the corner of the church to see what was taking so long. She did not look at him. She looked at Silas, at the calluses on his hands and the honest tiredness in his face, and made a decision that would reshape the rest of both their lives. "I would rather build something real," she said. They were married that same afternoon in the same church, with half the guests still in their seats out of sheer disbelief, and Sheriff Dunbar's grin had gone considerably thinner by the time the preacher pronounced them husband and wife. Leanne Zhao became Leanne Farron, with a voice that did not shake once, and when Silas took her hand in front of the altar, he found it steadier than his own. The ride out to the ranch took the better part of 2 hours, the wagon rattling over dry ruts baked hard by a summer that had not seen rain in 6 weeks, and neither of them spoke much along the way. Leanne watched the land pass, gold grass rolling out flat toward a horizon that seemed to have no end to it, and Silas watched her out of the corner of his eye, trying to read a woman who gave away almost nothing on her face. "You were wondering if you made a mistake," Leanne said eventually, not turning her head. "I'm wondering what your sister's running off is going to cost us both," Silas admitted. "Otis Dunbar doesn't let a thing like a runaway bride go quiet. He'll make sport of it at the saloon till Christmas." "Let him talk," Leanne said. "Talk has never once fed a family or paid a debt." The house, when they reached it, was a plain 2-story clapboard with a wide porch and a barn that needed a new roof, sitting alone against the enormous sky, the way most ranch houses in that country did, an island of human stubbornness in an ocean of grass. Leanne stood in the yard for a long moment, taking it in, and Silas found himself watching her reaction the way a man watches weather, trying to guess which way it would break. "It needs work," she said finally. "It does." "Good," Leanne said. "I would rather have work than idleness. Idleness is where I go to thinking about things I cannot fix." That was the first evening Silas began to understand that the sheriff had been wrong about her being quiet as a church mouse. Leanne Farron was quiet the way still water was quiet, deep and purposeful, and hiding more current beneath the surface than anyone standing on the bank ever guessed. She walked the house room by room before supper, running her fingers along the windowsills, testing the give of the floorboards near the hearth, opening cabinets that had not been touched since Silas's mother died. She did not comment on the dust or the bachelor's disorder of the place, the boots left by the door, the single chipped plate he had used for years out of habit rather than choice. She simply began setting things right, quietly, without asking permission or waiting to be told what needed doing. And by the time the sun dropped behind the western ridge, she had swept the kitchen, mended a torn curtain with stitches so fine Silas had to hold the fabric to the lamplight to find them, and set a supper on the table that tasted like something a real home might produce. Silas watched her from the doorway of the kitchen for longer than he meant to, arms crossed, saying nothing. And when she finally noticed him there, she did not startle the way most women might at being watched unannounced. She simply met his eyes, steady and unbothered, and gestured toward the empty chair across from her own. "Sit," she said. "The beans will not improve with waiting, and neither will this silence between us." He sat, and for the first time in 11 years, the sound of two people eating supper together in that kitchen did not feel like an absence being endured. It felt, faintly and improbably, like the beginning of something. The trouble started 3 weeks later, when a man named Hollis Beck rode out to the Farron Ranch with a folded paper and a smile that did not reach his eyes. Beck ran the Territorial Bank in Redding Creek and had spent the better part of a decade quietly buying up notes on ranches whose owners had a bad season or two, waiting patiently for the moment a man could not make his payment, and then foreclosing before the ink on the original loan had properly dried. He had wanted the Farron land for 3 years, ever since he'd learned there was a spring-fed creek running through the eastern pasture that never dried up even in the worst drought years, water valuable enough in that country to be worth killing over, and he had never once found a lever he could use against Silas Farron until now. "Your note's due in full come September," Beck said, not bothering to dismount, his horse shifting under him in the heat. "Seeing as you just took on a wife with no dowry and a broken engagement trailing behind her, I figured you'd want to know I'm not inclined to extend the terms this year." "That note isn't due till next spring," Silas said, keeping his voice level, though something cold had settled in his stomach. "We signed for 18 months. "Read your paper again, Farron." Beck's smile widened, thin and satisfied. "Clause near the bottom. Bank reserves the right to call the note due if the borrower's circumstances change materially." "I'd say a runaway bride and a hasty replacement counts as a material change, wouldn't you?" Leanne had come out onto the porch by then, drying her hands on her apron, and she watched the exchange with an expression that gave nothing away, though Silas would learn later that she had already begun calculating, in the quiet architecture of her mind, exactly how many ways there were to fight a man like Hollis Beck. "You have 30 days, Beck said, turning his horse. "I'd start finding $4,000 if I were you." He rode off in a cloud of dust that hung gold and slow in the summer light, and Silas stood in the yard with his jaw tight, watching the only home he had ever built start to slip through his fingers over a clause he had never read closely enough. He went inside and found the original loan papers in the tin box where he kept every document that mattered: the deed, the tax receipts, the letter announcing his brother's death, and spread them across the kitchen table with hands that were not quite steady. The clause was there, exactly as Beck had said, buried in small, cramped print near the bottom of the second page, and Silas felt something close to shame settle over him at having signed a document he had trusted rather than read. His father had always told him a man's word was worth more than his signature, and his father had never once had to deal with a banker like Hollis Beck. "You could not have known," Leanne said, coming to stand behind his chair, reading the clause over his shoulder without asking permission to look. "Men like Beck write papers specifically so that honest men will not think to read them twice. That is not a failure of your character. It is a failure of his." "Doesn't change what he can do to us come September." "No," she agreed, "but knowing exactly how he intends to do it is the first advantage we have had all day." "He wants the water," Leanne said quietly, once Beck was gone. "Not the debt. The creek." Silas turned to look at her. "How do you know that?" "Because a man who only wanted money would have taken a payment plan and collected interest for years," Leanne said. "A man who wants land waits for weakness and then calls the whole debt at once, so the owner cannot possibly pay and must sell instead. My father dealt with men like this in San Francisco. They smile the whole time they are taking everything from you." That night, over a supper of beans and cornbread eaten mostly in silence, Silas found himself telling her things he had not told anyone since his mother died. About the brother who had drowned trying to cross the river during spring melt. About the father who had never been the same after. About the 11 years of building something out of nothing, with no one beside him to share the weight of it. Leanne listened without interrupting, her hands still, her eyes steady on his face, and when he finally ran out of words, she reached across the table and set her hand over his, the first time she had touched him without it being required by ceremony or circumstance. "I did not marry a stranger for a debt alone," she said quietly. "I want you to know that. Somewhere on the road out here, it stopped being only about the money." Silas looked at her hand on his, small and work-roughened already after only 3 weeks on the ranch, and felt something loosen in his chest that had been wound tight for 11 years. "I wasn't looking to feel anything for the woman who ended up standing at my altar," he said. "Seems I didn't have much say in the matter." She did not answer that directly, but she did not move her hand either, and outside the window the last light was going purple over the grass, and for the first time since the wedding, the silence in that house did not feel empty. The second blow came 10 days later, and it was worse than the first. Silas rode into town for supplies and found the general store owner unwilling to extend him the usual credit, the blacksmith suddenly too busy to shoe his horse before the following week, and half the men at the saloon watching him with the particular careful politeness of people who had been told something and were waiting to see if it was true. He found out what it was from the newspaper pinned up outside the sheriff's office. Hollis Beck had taken out a notice claiming the Farron Ranch was insolvent and would be seized for auction of assets within the month unless the note was satisfied in full. And beneath the notice, in smaller print that felt somehow more vicious for its restraint, was a line suggesting the marriage itself had been a hasty arrangement of convenience unlikely to survive the ranch's financial collapse. "He's turning the whole town against us before he's even called the note proper," Silas said that evening, pacing the length of the kitchen while Leanne sat calm at the table, mending a shirt with small, precise stitches. "Every merchant in Redding Creek is going to think twice about doing business with a man everyone believes is finished." "Then we do not let them believe it," Leanne said without looking up from her needle. "You said the Eastern Creek never runs dry. What else runs on that water besides your own cattle?" Silas stopped pacing. "The Hendricks spread borders us to the east. Their well's gone brackish the last 2 summers. They've been hauling water in barrels since June." "And the Coolidge Ranch to the south?" "Same trouble. Worse. Old man Coolidge lost 40 head last year to the drought before he found a spring on his own land, and even that one's weak." Leanne set down her mending and looked at him with an expression he had not seen on her before, something sharp and clear-eyed that had nothing of the quiet church mouse the sheriff had promised. "Then you have something Hollis Beck does not understand you have," she said. "You have water that other men need, and men in trouble remember who helped them long after they forget who lent them money." It took Silas half a day to understand what she meant, and once he did, he could not believe he had not seen it himself. He rode out the next morning to the Hendricks spread and then to the Coolidge Ranch and offered both families access to the eastern creek for their stock through the rest of the drought season, asking nothing in return but their word, given freely, that they would say so plainly if anyone in town asked whether Silas Farron was a man worth trusting. Word moved through a town like Redding Creek the way water moved through dry ground, fast and low and impossible to stop once it started. Within a week, the same merchants who had hesitated over credit were shaking Silas's hand in the street, and the story circulating at the saloon was no longer about a runaway bride, but about a rancher generous enough to share his water with neighbors in the worst drought in a decade. Hollis Beck heard about it 3 days later, and he rode out to the Farron Ranch himself this time, his composure fraying at the edges for the first time since Silas had known him. "You think giving away water to a couple of desperate ranchers is going to save you $4,000? Beck said, dismounting this time, his boots kicking up dust as he crossed the yard. "The note comes due in 11 days, regardless of how many friends you've bought yourself." "Funny thing about friends," Silas said, standing his ground on his own porch with Leanne a step behind him, close enough that he could feel her presence like a hand at his back. "Coolidge and Hendricks both bank with you, Beck. Seems like a poor time to be squeezing the one man who just kept their cattle alive." Something flickered behind Beck's eyes, the first real uncertainty Silas had seen from him. "That's not your concern." "It is now." Leanne stepped forward, her voice as level and clear as it had been that first day outside the church. "Mr. Beck, I have read the note you hold on this ranch. The clause you cited requires proof of material change in the borrower's ability to repay, not merely a change in circumstance. My husband's ability to repay has not changed. If anything, his standing in this town has improved considerably in the last week, as I imagine you have noticed." Beck's jaw tightened. "You'd know contract law, would you, being fresh off a boat from San Francisco?" "My father managed shipping contracts for the Port Authority for 20 years, Leanne said, unbothered by the insult in his tone. "I read every document that crossed his desk from the time I was 12 years old. If you attempt to seize this ranch on grounds that do not exist in the paper you yourself drew up, I will make certain the territorial judge in Bannock sees exactly how thin your case is, and I will make certain every rancher in this valley knows precisely what kind of bank they have been trusting with their notes." The silence that followed stretched long enough for a hawk to cross the whole width of the sky above the yard before Hollis Beck finally spoke again, and when he did, some of the confidence had gone out of his voice entirely. "You've got till September, like the original note said," he muttered, swinging back up onto his horse. "But don't think this is finished, Farron. Water like that creek doesn't stay unclaimed forever." He rode off without the satisfaction he had arrived with, and Silas stood on the porch beside his wife of barely a month, watching the dust settle, feeling something in his chest that had nothing to do with fear anymore. "You could have told me you read contracts," he said. "You never asked," Leanne said simply. "There is a great deal about me you have not yet asked, Silas Farron. I am beginning to think you might be the kind of man who actually wants to know the answers." That night was the first time he kissed her, out on the porch with the crickets loud in the grass and the whole sky gone deep purple overhead, and it was not the kiss of a bargain being sealed. It was slower than that, more careful, the kind of thing two people did when they had finally stopped measuring each other for weakness and started looking instead for what they might build together. The final trouble came in the last week of August, and it came from a direction neither of them had prepared for. Leon's older sister, the one who had fled the church a month before, arrived at the ranch unannounced in a hired buggy, her face pale and her hands shaking, with a story that turned Leon's careful composure to stone for the first time since Silas had known her. Her name was Ewan, and she had not run from fear of marriage alone. She had run because a man from San Francisco named Reginald Voss, to whom their late father had owed a gambling debt before his death, had followed her across the ocean with the belief that the marriage broker's arrangement was meant to settle that debt through her, not through any legitimate contract, and he had found her in Redding Creek 2 days ago, threatening to take what he believed he was owed by force if she did not come with him willingly. "He is in town now," Ewan said, her voice breaking, "at the boarding house. He says he will go to the sheriff and claim I stole passage money if I do not agree to leave with him tonight." Silas felt the old cold anger rise in him, the same feeling he'd had watching his bride flee the church a month ago, except sharper now, personal in a way it had not been before. "Sheriff Dunbar's not going to side with a stranger over 2 women this town has come to know," he said. "Sheriff Dunbar," Leon said grimly, "sides with whoever is loudest and whoever buys the next round at the saloon. We cannot rely on him for justice. We must handle this ourselves." They rode into town together that evening, all 3 of them, and found Reginald Voss exactly where Ewan said he would be. A thin, sharp-featured man in an ill-fitting coat, holding court at the boarding house with the kind of oily confidence that came from a man who had never once faced consequences for the harm he caused. He smiled when he saw Ewan come through the door, a smile that made Silas's hands curl into fists at his sides. "There you are," Voss said. "Come to your senses, have you? Or has your sister decided to buy your freedom the way she bought her own husband?" "I have not bought anything," Leanne said, her voice cutting through the room with a precision that silenced the low murmur of conversation around them. "But I have brought a witness, Mr. Voss, and a letter." She produced from her coat a folded document that Ewan had carried across the ocean without either Silas or Leanne knowing it existed. A formal notice from the San Francisco Port Authority, dated and sealed, confirming that their father's gambling debts had been settled in full by the sale of his shipping interest before his death, and that no outstanding claim existed against either daughter. "My father worked for the Port Authority for 20 years, Leanne said, into the stunned silence of the boarding-house parlor. "I told you that once already, Mr. Beck, though I see you are not the only man in this territory who underestimates what a woman might know about the law. I kept a copy of every document that mattered to my family, Mr. Voss, because I learned a long time ago that men like you rely on women having nothing to prove them wrong." Voss's composure cracked for the first time, his eyes darting toward the door, toward the small gathering crowd of Redding Creek residents who had come to see what the commotion was about and were now watching him with open suspicion. "This is a misunderstanding," he started. "It is fraud," Silas said, stepping forward, "and there's a marshal riding through this territory every 6 weeks who'd be real interested to hear about a man harassing 2 women over a debt that doesn't exist. You've got till morning to be gone from Redding Creek, Voss, or I'll make certain he hears every word of it." For a long moment Voss said nothing at all, his eyes moving from the letter in Leanne's hand to the marshal's badge Silas had pointedly mentioned to the row of unfriendly faces now crowding the boarding-house doorway. And Silas watched the man's calculation happen in real time, the same calculation he had seen cross Hollis Beck's face a month before, the particular arithmetic of a bully realizing the numbers had turned against him. Voss opened his mouth once more as if to argue the document's authenticity, but the innkeeper, a heavy-set woman named Prudence Argyle, who had already grown fond of Ewan's quiet company over the past weeks, folded her arms across her chest and made it plain with a single hard look that she would not be renting him a room past morning, regardless of what he decided to do next. "You have made a habit, I think, of finding women who have no one to speak for them," Leanne said, her voice quieter now but no less certain. "You did not expect to find one who kept her own records." Voss left before sunrise, and he did not come back. Ewan stayed on at the Farron Ranch through the end of summer, helping where she could, slowly unclenching from the fear she had carried since the day their father died. And by the time the first cool nights of September arrived, she had begun to laugh again, quietly, at things Silas said over supper, in a way that reminded Leanne of who her sister had been before the debt and the ocean and the running had worn her down to something smaller. The note to Hollis Beck came due on the 15th of September, and Silas paid it in full, in coin, standing in the bank with Leanne at his side and half the ranchers of the valley watching through the window, because word had spread that the Farron family intended to settle their debt in public, and nobody in Redding Creek wanted to miss it. Beck counted the money with tight, unhappy hands and said nothing at all, and when Silas and Leanne walked out of that bank together, the whole street seemed to exhale. 3 months later, in the first hard frost of early winter, the Farron Ranch looked nothing like it had on the day of the wedding that never happened. The barn had a new roof, paid for by grateful neighbors who had never forgotten a summer of shared water during the worst drought in a decade. Ewan had taken work as a seamstress in town, her shop doing steady business from women who valued careful, precise stitching, and she visited the ranch every Sunday with a lightness in her step that had not existed in August. And Hollis Beck, having lost the confidence of half the ranchers in the valley, sold his interest in the Territorial Bank the following spring and left Redding Creek for good, a fact that surprised no one who had watched the events of that summer unfold. Leanne Farron stood on the porch one evening in December, watching snow settle soft and silent over the grass that had been gold and dry the day she arrived, and Silas came to stand beside her the way he had every evening since the wedding that had started as a joke and become, somehow, the truest thing either of them had ever built. "Sheriff Dunbar still tells the story wrong at the saloon," Silas said. "Says he's the one who saved the day, offering you up like he did." "Let him tell it however flatters him," Leanne said, and there was warmth in her voice now, easy and unguarded in a way it had not been that first day outside the church. "We know how it happened. That is enough." Silas took her hand, the same hand that had once trembled in her lap in the second pew of a church full of strangers laughing at her, and found it steady now, sure of itself, sure of him. "I didn't marry the woman I planned to marry," he said. "Turned out to be the best mistake I ever made." "It was not a mistake," Leanne said quietly. "It was a choice. I made it standing behind that church with my chin up, and I have not once regretted it." The snow kept falling, soft and even, over a ranch that had nearly been lost, and a family that had built itself out of nothing but stubbornness and honesty. And somewhere out past the eastern pasture, the creek that had almost cost them everything ran on quiet and unclaimed beneath the ice, exactly where it belonged. Inside, the lamp Leanne had lit that first evening still burned in the kitchen window every night without fail, a small, steady light against the dark, the same window she had swept clean with her own hands the day she arrived, expecting nothing more than the settling of a debt. Neighbors passing on the road toward town had come to look for that light without quite realizing why, the way a person looks for something familiar and steady in a world that rarely offers either. It meant the Farron house was awake. It meant, more than that whoever needed shelter from the cold would find the door unlocked and a place set at the table, because that was the kind of household Silas and Leanne had built together, out of a wedding that had begun as another man's cruel joke and ended as the truest partnership Redding Creek had ever witnessed. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.